"I don't love you anymore. I want a divorce." It was with this cold phrase that an entire relationship collapsed, leaving behind a heavy silence and a humiliation impossible to ignore. While she left confidently, believing she was freeing herself from a man with no future, he chose the most unexpected path, not to react, not to justify himself, only to observe. But behind that apparent defeat, there existed a carefully hidden truth, something that was about to turn the tables in a brutal way. And when this truth finally came to light, it was already too late for any regret or second chance. Before discovering how this story ends, subscribe to the channel and come see how silence can be the most powerful response of all. The suitcase had been ready since the afternoon. He noticed this when he arrived home at 8 at night, after an entire day in front of the computer at a Villa Olympia co-working space, and saw the dark wine Samsonite in the middle of the living room like a sentence already passed. It wasn't the first time she had threatened, but there was something in the position of that suitcase, in the exactness with which it had been placed in the center of the Persian rug they bought together on a trip to Lisboa, that said this time was different. The apartment was silent in a way that hurt, that late afternoon silence that has no birds, no television, no smell of dinner being prepared, only the still air and that suitcase in the center of everything. Raphael Drummond took off his coat, hung it on the dining table chair, and went to the kitchen to drink water. His hands were slightly damp. He recognized that sensation as fear, but he refused to let it rise to his face. He had learned, throughout 3 years of marriage to Isabella Vasconcelos, that showing vulnerability was offering an opening, and she knew exactly how to pierce through any opening with surgical precision. She appeared in the hallway, wearing a dress he had never seen, her hair tied up with that calculated elegance she used when she wanted to appear untouchable. Isabella was an interior architect. She had her own office in Itayim Bibi and a presence that filled any room. People used to say she and Raphael made a beautiful couple. He never knew for sure what that meant about him, but he knew what it meant about her. That appearance was always the language she preferred to speak. "I don't love you anymore. I want a divorce." She said this without drama, without a choking voice, without the hesitation that words of such weight should carry. She said it like someone informing that they are going to change their cell phone. And then she stood still, observing the effect the phrase would produce in him, like someone who threw a stone into the water and waits for the circles to form. Raphael placed the glass in the sink. He turned to her. He said nothing. She filled the silence with everything she had been keeping inside. She spoke about the smaller apartment they had to rent after he left his job at the technology multinational where he had worked for 5 years. She spoke about the plans that were postponed, the trips that didn't happen, the dinners at Spot that stopped being part of their routine. She spoke about the feeling of regressing while her friends moved forward, about waking up in the morning and feeling the weight of a life that was not the one she had imagined when she accepted the marriage proposal. That night in Trancoso, with the dark sea in the background and a bottle of sparkling wine on the sand. And she spoke about Enrique Castillo. Not by that name, not with that clarity, but the words she chose left a precise outline, a silhouette that Raphael had already noticed in the last few weeks, in the messages she forgot open on her phone, in the perfumes that didn't match hers when she arrived late, in the way she had stopped asking questions about the project he was working on. Enrique was a partner in a real estate developer in Brooklyn. He attended the same events as Isabella. He had the kind of visible wealth that she always confused with real value. Raphael remained in silence. This irritated her more than any response would have. "Don't you have anything to say?" No reaction. "That's exactly why, Raphael. You are like this with everything. Still. Stagnant. You spend entire nights in front of that computer as if you were going to save the world, but the world keeps spinning without you noticing. Meanwhile, I stay here watching my life shrink along with the bank account." He could have said a lot at that moment. He could have explained what he was building, what those nights represented, the size of what was about to happen. He could have opened the notebook right there, shown the numbers, the conversations with the first investors, the emails from companies that were already showing interest. But he looked into her eyes and saw that the conversation was already over long before it began. She wasn't there to understand. She was there to leave with the certainty that she was making the right choice, that the fault was his, that the future she wanted existed on the other side of that door, and Raphael would not take that from her. "All right, Isabella, I'll sign." She blinked, slightly disconcerted by the absence of resistance. Then she composed her posture, raised her chin, and said that her lawyer would send the papers by the end of the week. Total separation of assets. She would keep the apartment that her father had helped buy when they got married, the furniture she chose over the years, the car that was in her name. He would keep the computer, the accounts in the red, and the public narrative of a man who didn't know how to hold on to his own life or his own woman. Raphael said he was fine with that. She grabbed the suitcase, called the elevator, and left without looking back. The sound of the door closing had that kind of finality that everyday sounds don't usually have. He stood listening to the elevator descend, the metallic click downstairs, and then nothing. Raphael stayed alone in the apartment for maybe 15 minutes, listening to the silence she left. That silence different from before, cleaner in a way, more honest. Then he went to the table, opened the notebook, and went back to the code. There was an integration module he had been trying to solve for 3 days, a synchronization problem between servers that behaved unpredictably under high load. His head was heavy, but his hands knew the way. That night, at 2 in the morning, the module worked. He looked at the screen for a long moment, felt something settle in his chest with a kind of dense calm, a firmness that didn't depend on anyone else to exist. He closed the computer. He slept as he hadn't slept in weeks. The divorce papers arrived the following Thursday, delivered by a motoboy with the logo of a law firm from Jardim Paulista. Raphael read each clause slowly, like someone reading a technical contract, without haste and without visible emotion. The agreement was clear. Total separation of assets, no sharing of future assets, no financial link after signing. It was the kind of document designed to protect the one who drafted it. It was exactly what she wanted, and without her knowing, it was exactly what he needed. He signed every marked page, photographed the documents, saved a digital copy in 3 different places, and returned the original via the same motoboy the next day. He didn't hire a lawyer. He didn't ask for a review. He signed like someone who knows the exact weight of what he is signing, even if no one around can see why. In the days that followed, Raphael began organizing the move. There wasn't much to take: clothes, technical books, 2 monitors, the notebook, and an external hard drive that held 5 years of work compressed into less than 2 terabytes. He rented a studio in Pinheiros, in an old building on Teodoro Sampaio Street, 3rd floor, window with a view of the canopy of a fig tree that grew crookedly on the cobblestone sidewalk. The studio had mold in a corner of the bathroom, noisy plumbing, and an outlet that sparked if you pulled the plug too fast. It was small, ugly, and absolutely adequate for what he needed to do. He set up the 2 monitors on the raw wood table he bought for 300 reais in a thrift store on Cardoso de Almeida Street, installed the development environment, opened a coffee he bought at the corner bakery, and worked for 14 hours straight. Outside, São Paulo functioned as always, noisy, indifferent, in constant motion. Inside here, a man the world thought defeated was building, line by line, something the world didn't yet know it needed. And that crooked fig tree down there, which insisted on growing in a place no one had planned for it, seemed like the only witness capable of understanding what was happening on that 3rd floor. Pinheiros had its own rhythm that Raphael learned in the first few weeks. The corner bakery opened at 6:30, the sound of the garbage truck passed at 7:15, and the neighbor on the 2nd floor, a musician he never saw in person, began playing the guitar around 10 at night, with almost metronomic regularity. It was a small, predictable world, and completely different from the apartment in Moema, where he had lived with Isabella, with its uniformed doorman and its party hall they never used. He didn't miss it. He was surprised by that. What he felt sometimes was a kind of strange lightness, like someone who carried a heavy backpack for so long that they forgot the weight until the moment they took it off their back. There were pressures that simply ceased to exist, the questions about when they would buy a larger car, the silent comparisons with the husbands of her friends, the dinners where he had to feign enthusiasm for conversations that didn't interest him. Now there was only him, the computer, and that studio that smelled like old books. The project was called Fluxara. It wasn't a name he had chosen with marketing care. It emerged in the early hours of the second year of development, when he was debugging a data flow error, and the word appeared in his head as the most honest description of what he was trying to build. A system that made things flow, that took away friction, that eliminated the invisible congestion that cost companies fortunes without them knowing exactly where the loss came from. Fluxara was an intelligent logistics management software, not the kind of generic tool that any consultancy sold as a solution for everything. It was specific, surgical, developed from 5 years of observing from the inside how large retail and distribution operations failed at points no one monitored with enough attention. The interfaces between systems, the bottlenecks in shift changes, the micro-inefficiencies that individually seemed insignificant and together consumed between 8 and 15% of the operating margin. Raphael had identified this problem while he was still working at the multinational. He spent 2 years collecting data internally, mapping patterns, building the first prototypes in his spare time. When he left, he took the knowledge and left the job. What was left behind was the salary, the stability, and, it seemed, the marriage. Isabella never understood what he was doing. She saw a man who had abandoned a secure career to spend nights staring at a screen, without revenue, without a visible agenda for success, without the kind of progress she could see. And Raphael, who knew that explaining would be useless without having something concrete to show, chose silence. It was a communication error that cost the marriage, but it would be an error that only history could evaluate. In the Pinheiro studio, without the pressure of her expectations, the work accelerated. There was a different concentration now, cleaner. He woke up early, drank coffee while reviewing what he had written the day before, spent mornings on core development and afternoons testing in simulated environments. Sometimes he went out to walk in Parque Augusta, where the people sitting on the benches had that air of those who deliberately chose to stay out of the race. He liked to observe that. Not out of identification, but by contrast. He wasn't out of the race. He was in a different race on a path that most people couldn't see. It was on one of those afternoons that Claudio Meneses appeared in his life. They had met years before, at a technology event at the WTC, and maintained sporadic contact through LinkedIn. Claudio was one of the partners of a venture capital firm based in Faria Lima, small but respected, known for betting on B2B software when it wasn't yet the fashion it later became. He had asked to have a coffee after seeing a technical publication Raphael had made in a specialized forum, an analysis of logistical inefficiency that had circulated more than Raphael expected. They met at a cafeteria on Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães Street in Itaim. Claudio arrived on time, ordered a double espresso, and spent the first 10 minutes asking objective questions. He wasn't the type to beat around the bush. Tell me about the product, not the pitch, the real product. Raphael liked the question. He opened the notebook, showed the architecture, explained the problem it solved, with the specificity of someone who spent years living inside it. Claudio listened without interrupting, wrote some things down in a small notebook, and asked 3 questions at the end, all technical and all precise. When they said goodbye, an hour and a half later, Claudio said only, "I'm going to talk to the partners." Raphael went home without knowing what that meant, but he felt that something was moving, something that didn't yet have a shape but already had weight. That same week, while Raphael waited in silence for any feedback from Claudio, his cell phone received a message he didn't expect. It was Isabella's lawyer. The message was dry and formal. The client requested the transfer of the Volvo XC40 vehicle, registered in the name of the respondent, as stipulated in the separation agreement. Raphael reread the message twice. The car was formally in his name, the result of a bureaucratic confusion at the time of purchase, but it had been paid for in full by her. He always knew it was hers. The separation agreement had a generic clause about movable assets that, depending on the reading, could include or exclude the vehicle. The lawyer was clearly betting that Raphael would fight, that he would turn it into a prolonged dispute, a negotiation with counter-proposals, maybe a lawsuit. It was the kind of move made when one wants to drain the opponent. Raphael responded the next day with a 3-line message. He confirmed the transfer suggested a date to sign the documents at the notary's office, and asked what time was most convenient for the other party. Simple as that. The lawyer took an entire day to respond, as if the absence of resistance had confused him. When he came back, he confirmed the date and time with a formality that sounded almost disconcerted. Raphael went to the notary's office, signed the transfer documents, and left there on foot. He called an Uber on the corner, returned to Pinheiros and opened the computer. There was a performance adjustment in the predictive analysis module that needed attention. That was what he was going to spend the energy on that could have been wasted on a fight over a car that, a few months from then, would make no difference to him. The phone rang at 6 o'clock that same afternoon. It was Claudio. The partners liked it. They wanted to schedule a formal presentation the following week. It could be at their office in Faria Lima on a Wednesday morning. Raphael confirmed, thanked him with the restraint of someone who doesn't want to reveal how much that call mattered, and hung up. He stood a moment looking out the window at the fig tree on the sidewalk, which on that late afternoon of a São Paulo autumn was partially covered by the shadow of the building next door. There was something about that tree he couldn't stop observing. It had found exactly the space it needed, even if it was a space no one had left for it on purpose. Isabella Vasconcelos learned early on that life is divided between those who are seen and those who are not, and that belonging to the first group was a matter of choice and discipline. Her mother, a practical woman from the interior of Minas who had arrived in São Paulo with one suitcase and a determination of iron, used to say that appearance is the business card you hand over before opening your mouth. Isabella took this to an extreme that her mother perhaps hadn't imagined. Her office in Itaim had that kind of decoration that communicates competence before any word is spoken. Clean lines, noble materials used with restraint, no superfluous elements. She had built Vasconcelos Interiores with genuine talent and an ability to understand what the client wanted even before they knew how to name it. She was good at what she did. That was never the problem. The problem was that she had learned to evaluate everything, including people, with the same criteria she used to evaluate spaces. What this communicates, what this is worth, what this says about who owns it. Enrique Castillo communicated a lot. He was 42 years old, hair beginning to grey at the temples in a way that in men is usually called distinguished, and the natural ease of someone who grew up among people with money and learned that money doesn't need to announce itself because it was already introduced by others long before your arrival. A partner in Castillo Incorporações, a family business that had expanded considerably in recent years with high-end developments in Perdizes and Alto de Pinheiros. He attended the same events as Isabella, knew the same people, and had the right vocabulary for every situation. They met for the first time at a launch cocktail party for a development in Campobello, 6 months before the end of the marriage with Raphael. Enrique had sought her out afterward, under the pretext of discussing the decoration of some model apartments. The pretext was transparent, but Isabella accepted it because it was convenient to accept it. Now 2 months after the divorce, they were seen together frequently enough to feed the kind of speculation that circulates in the message groups of the upper middle classes of São Paulo. Isabella posted with calculated moderation a photo at a restaurant in Jardins, another on a weekend in Campos do Jordão, always with the right lighting and the appropriate caption. Nothing excessive, just enough. What she didn't post, because there was no way to photograph it well, was the growing feeling that Enrique was a shiny surface over a structure she hadn't yet examined with enough care. But that was something for later. For now, the narrative worked, and it worked especially well when news of Raphael arrived. Through mutual acquaintances, she learned that he was living in a studio in Pinheiros, taking Ubers and spending his days in front of the computer as always. The image confirmed what she needed to be true, that leaving had been the right choice, that she had escaped a trajectory that only led downward. Every time someone mentioned his name with that discreetly sorrowful tone people use when they talk about someone who is doing poorly, she felt a relief she preferred not to examine too closely. That Wednesday, she was in the office reviewing the project for an apartment in Higienópolis when Fernanda, her assistant, entered with 2 coffees and an air of someone who has information and doesn't know if they should share it. "Isabella, did you see Carol's post?" Carol was Carol Drummond, Raphael's sister-in-law, with whom Isabella maintained a civilized relationship, that the divorce had transformed into an educated coldness. Isabella took her phone and found the post, a photo of Carol and Raphael in a restaurant in Villa Maddalena, smiling. The caption was simple, almost informal, "Well-deserved celebration with my favorite brother." Isabella looked at the photo for longer than she intended. Raphael was different. Not in a dramatic way. It wasn't the kind of transformation that could be described with precision. But there was something in his posture, in the quality of the smile, that didn't match the image of the defeated man she had built over the last few months. "What do you think they are celebrating?" Fernanda asked, with that innocent curiosity that is sometimes sharper than malice. Isabella put the phone on the table, turned back to the project on the screen, and said she had no idea, and that they needed to finish the review before 5. But the question remained. That afternoon, while reviewing lighting references for the Higienopolis project, she found herself thinking about things she hadn't thought about for a long time. About how Raphael was, in fact, different from any man she had known before him. Not in the sense she valued at the time, not in the sense of social presence or visible assets, but in something she couldn't name with precision and which for that very reason she had discarded as insufficient. There was a quality of attention in him that was rare. When he listened, he really listened. When he said he was going to do something, he did it. When he believed in something, he believed it with a consistency that didn't waver in the face of others' opinions. She had called it stubbornness. Now, sitting before a project that didn't interest her as much as it should, she wondered if the right name might be something else. She shook her head mentally like someone brushing away a useless thought. That night, Henrique picked her up for dinner at a new Japanese restaurant on Oscar Freire that everyone was frequenting. He was excited, spoke about a launch planned for the second half of the year, about a partnership with a construction company from Rio, about plans that sounded big and busy. Isabella listened with the appropriate smile and drank the cold sake and said the right things at the right moments. On the way home, alone in the Uber, while Henrique stayed to have a drink with a partner who had appeared at the restaurant, she looked out the window at the lights of Paulista and felt, for the first time since the divorce, a spark of something that looked dangerously like doubt. She extinguished it before it could turn into a flame. But sparks, as she would discover later, don't disappear just because we pretend not to see them. The next morning, Raphael arrived at the firm's office in Faria Lima 20 minutes early. It was an entire floor in a glass and concrete building that had that view of the avenue which in Sao Paulo serves as a tacit measure of credibility. The higher up, the more serious. He sat in the reception area, refused the coffee the receptionist offered, and sat looking at the cars down below with the calm of someone who has nothing to prove, only something to present. Claudio received him with two partners, Paulo Estrella and Miriam Takahashi, both with backgrounds in technology companies before migrating to the investment side. It was exactly the kind of panel Raphael would have chosen if he could choose. People who understood the product, not just the market. The presentation lasted 55 minutes. He showed the problem, the solution, the internal test data he had run with a medium-sized distribution company in Guarulhos that had agreed to be an informal pilot, the efficiency numbers the system had generated, and the conservative projection of adoption in the first 2 years if the product went to market with the appropriate support. Miriam asked the hardest questions, especially about scalability and how the system would behave with large-scale clients with legacy architectures. Raphael answered them all without hesitating because he had spent the last few months asking himself exactly those questions. When he finished, Claudio looked at his partners and then at Raphael and said, "We need a week to talk internally, but I want you to know that this is the most solid presentation I've sat through in the last year." Raphael thanked them, shook hands with the three, and went down alone in the glass elevator. Outside, Faria Lima was in its usual rhythm, that flow of people and cars that never stops. He walked to the avenue, breathed the warm Sao Paulo air, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. That time was working in his favor. The week Claudio had asked for turned into 10 days. Raphael counted each of them without letting anxiety take the space that concentration needed. He continued in the rhythm of the studio, waking up early, code in the morning, tests in the afternoon, walking in Parque Augusta when his head needed air. It was an almost monastic discipline, and he had learned to like it. On the morning of the 11th day, the phone rang at 8:40. It was Claudio, with the voice of someone who sleeps well and wakes up ready for business. The partners were in. They wanted to do a seed round that would give Fluxara the capital necessary to hire the first engineers, structure the commercial area, and put the product in a controlled launch phase. In exchange, the firm would take a minority stake that preserved Raphael's control over product decisions. The terms were fair. Raphael recognized this even before consulting any specialist. They agreed to meet with the lawyers the following week to formalize the deal. When he hung up, Raphael sat for a moment on the bed, still in his pajamas, with the phone in his hand and the screen blank. There was no one to celebrate with at that moment, no one on the other side of the apartment waiting for the news. And even so, or perhaps because of it, the feeling was intense in a way he didn't expect. Clean, whole, completely his. He called his sister. Carol answered on the third call, her voice still thick with sleep. And when he told her what had happened, she was silent for a second that seemed to last longer than it was, and then she screamed loud enough to wake her dog. She wanted to know everything, ask questions that weren't about money but about how he was, if he was sleeping, if he was eating right, if he was happy. That specific way of Carol's to love people without ceremony. He said he was fine, and it was true. While Raphael's life gained the silent substance of something that was working out, Isabella's life followed the different logic of a surface that needs to be constantly polished to continue looking intact. Henrique had begun to show some cracks that she didn't yet know how to classify. They weren't dramatic cracks, they weren't scenes or confrontations. It was something more subtle, a payment he postponed without a convincing explanation, a partners' meeting that lasted until dawn, and that he described in a way too vague for someone who used to be precise, a background tension that appeared and disappeared depending on the day. Isabella knew enough about business to know that these signs might mean nothing, and she knew enough about people to know they could mean everything. For now, she chose to believe in nothing. On a Thursday that month, she went to lunch with Patricia Fontes, a longtime friend who worked at an investment fund and who had the gift of knowing everything before everyone else without it being clear how she got that information. They had lunch at Easy Bistro in Jardin and talked about work, about an apartment Patricia was thinking of buying in Paquembu, about the renovation a mutual acquaintance was doing on a house in Perdizes. And then Patricia, with the calculated naturalness of someone who saved the subject for the right moment, mentioned Raphael's name. "I heard something interesting about your ex this week." Isabella took a sip of water before responding. "What was it?" "It seems he is negotiating an investment with Menezes Ventures. Do you know who they are?" Isabella knew. Everyone in the São Paulo corporate world knew. Menezes Ventures had a history of betting early and hitting with a consistency that the market respected. "It's a logistics software," Patricia continued, with that tone of someone describing something bigger than it seems. "It seems there are a lot of people interested. I heard the names of at least 2 larger funds that are looking for a subsequent round." Isabella placed the glass on the table with more care than necessary. "Who told you that?" Patricia gave a side smile that said everything about how she functioned. "You know how it is. São Paulo is big, but the market is small." The lunch continued. The conversations followed other paths, and Isabella behaved with her usual precision. The right questions, the appropriate comments, the smile in the right place. But something had changed inside that lunch, like when you move a heavy object and it leaves a mark on the floor that doesn't easily disappear. Back at the office, she sat for 40 minutes before the Higienopolis project without actually seeing what was on the screen. She thought about the separation agreement she had demanded with such care, about the total separation of assets her lawyer had drafted like a fortress. At the time, that was a protection against the risk of having to share her own savings with someone she judged to be sinking. Now that same document she had celebrated as a victory took on a different shape when illuminated by the news Patricia had planted at that lunch, with the precision of an experienced gardener. She opened her phone, went to Raphael's professional profile on LinkedIn, which was updated with only one position, Founder and CEO Fluxara. No details, no elaborate description. Only the name of the company and the start date, which she quickly calculated. He had formally created the company a few months before the divorce. A few months before. She put the phone in the drawer, closed the drawer, and went back to the project on the screen. Her hands were slightly cold, as they usually were when she was processing something she preferred not to process. She recognized the feeling and named it internally with the honesty one allows when no one is looking. It was the beginning of regret, still small, still controllable, but it was there. That same week, Rafael signed the contract with Menezes Ventures in a meeting room on the 22nd floor of a building in Faria Lima, with a view of the avenue that below followed its eternal rhythm of cars and urgencies. Claudia was on one side of the table, the lawyers on the other, and Rafael in the center with a pen in his hand, and the clear awareness that that moment was the result of every night that someone had called a waste. He signed without ceremony, with the same calm with which he had signed the divorce papers. But the weight was different, completely different, completely. Claudia wanted to have dinner to celebrate. Rafael accepted this time. They went to a simple restaurant in Villa Madalena without the kind of ostentation that the moment could have justified, and talked about the product, about the next steps, about the first clients who were already on the waiting list for the official pilot. It was a conversation between people who had work to do and who were happy exactly because of that. On the way out, while they waited for the Uber on the sidewalk, Claudio said something Rafael didn't expect. "Do you know what really convinced me? It wasn't the numbers, which were great. It was the way you spoke about the problem. You weren't selling me a solution. You were telling me about something you understood in a way no one else understood. That is rarer than it seems." Rafael thanked him without knowing exactly what to say, and he thought about that in the Uber back to Pinheiros. The fig tree on the sidewalk was silhouetted against the orange sky of late afternoon when he arrived. He went up the stairs, opened the studio, put the key on the entry table and looked at the two monitors waiting as always. There was a lot of work ahead, and for the first time in a long time, it sounded exactly as it should, like a promise, not like a wait. The months that followed were the most intense of Rafael's life, and also the most silent in the sense that mattered. No external pressure, no expectations from others to manage, only the work and what the work was revealing. With the capital from the seed round, he rented a small room in a private co-working space in Pinheiros, 3 blocks from the studio where he slept, and hired the first 2 engineers, Tiago, 26 years old, an expert in distributed systems who had left a failed logistics startup and was hungry in the right way. That technical hunger that isn't satisfied by a salary, but by an interesting problem. And Priya, 31 years old, a data engineer who had worked in São Paulo and Berlin, and had the rare ability to see patterns in volumes of information that most people saw as noise. The team was small and functioned as a single organism. They arrived early, worked with the silent intensity of those who know they are doing something worth the effort, and Rafael led by example more than by instruction. He was always the first to arrive, and rarely the first to leave. In parallel, the first pilot clients were being activated. A pharmacy chain with its own distribution in 6 states had agreed to test Fluxara for 90 days, with previously agreed metrics and an exit clause without penalty if the results were below expectations. It was the kind of agreement Rafael had proposed deliberately. No false guarantees, no overpromising, just the product being what it was and the numbers speaking for themselves. On the 28th day of the pilot, the operations director of the chain called Rafael personally. "I don't know what you guys did, but the cost per delivery dropped 11.3%. I need to understand this better." Rafael scheduled a meeting for the following week, prepared a detailed technical presentation, and went to their office in Tatuapé with Tiago. The meeting lasted 3 hours. On the way out, the director said he wanted to convert the pilot into an annual contract and recommend the product to 2 other companies in the group. It was the first external confirmation of what Rafael had believed for years in a small room in Pinheiros with a view of a crooked fig tree. The news of the contract reached Claudio before the end of the day. He sent a simple message, first of many. Rafael agreed. While Fluxara took its first concrete steps in the market, Isabella's life began to show those cracks she had been ignoring with growing determination. Henrique had cancelled 2 dinners in a row with justifications that sounded too rehearsed to be spontaneous. On social media, someone had tagged him in a photo at an event where he was supposedly in a meeting outside of São Paulo. Isabella saw the photo, remained silent before the screen, and then closed the app without doing anything, which in itself was an answer about where things stood. But there was something more concrete than Henrique's behavior that began to appear in those weeks. Marina, a colleague from the architecture sector whom she knew from events, met her one afternoon at the Iguatemi Gallery and said, with that delicacy that sometimes precedes difficult information, that she had heard comments about debts at the Castillo developer. Overdue construction works in Perdizes, suppliers with withheld payments, a story about a sold apartment that didn't have all the documentation in order. Isabella heard that with the same composure she displayed in difficult meetings with clients, but inside she felt the floor move a centimeter. In that way, only you notice. That night, she did what she had never done before. She informally hired a due diligence consultant who performed discreet asset investigations for family clients in delicate situations. It was a resource she knew because a friend had used it during a complicated inheritance process. It wasn't investigating Henrique out of personal distrust, she told herself. It was protecting her own assets. It was being smart. The consultant took 5 business days. The report he sent in a password-protected PDF was objective and unadorned. Castillo Incorporações had 3 ongoing labor lawsuits, 2 supplier actions for non-payment, and a tax liability that had been restructured the previous year, but continued to weigh on the balance sheet in a way that current cash flow did not comfortably sustain. Henrique's personal assets were partially committed as collateral for corporate debts. The castle, read coldly in that PDF, was made of paper. Isabella closed the document, placed the notebook on the table with that calm that appears when the shock is too great to produce an immediate reaction, and sat in the dark of her office for a few minutes. Then she went to the window and looked at the street below, at the passing cars, at the lights of a time which that night had that specific glow of things that continue happening regardless of what you are feeling. She had left a man who built something real to get close to one who displayed something false. The irony was so clean and so raw that it hurt in a way she didn't know how to name. And worst of all, she was starting to suspect it hadn't just been an error of judgment. It had been a choice based on values that, examined in the light of that PDF, were not the values she thought she had. She closed the window, turned off the office light, and went home alone, as she had done on so many nights since the divorce, but this time with an uncomfortable companion she couldn't leave outside. The truth about herself. That week, the name Fluxara appeared for the first time in a specialized B2B technology publication, a weekly newsletter that circulated among investors and executives in the sector. It was a discreet mention, 3 paragraphs in a section about startups to watch, but it reached Claudio's phone at 6 in the morning, and he forwarded it to Raphael with a message of only 2 words. It begins now. Raphael read it sitting on the bed with the coffee he had made 5 minutes before, still hot in his hand, and he felt that it was true. It wasn't a projection, it wasn't a hope, it was an observation. What had begun as an idea at a multinational where he had worked, grown in the early hours of an apartment in Moema, survived the divorce and matured in a studio in Pinheiros, was now entering the world with the solidity of something that didn't need to announce itself out loud to be taken seriously. He drank the coffee, opened the notebook and checked the data from the pharmacy chain pilot. The numbers from the 29th day were even better than those from the 28th. There was work to be done, as always. And as always, that sounded exactly right. 2 days later, without Raphael knowing, Isabella was in her office reviewing the Higienopolis project for the 10th time when she received a message from Henrique that she reread 3 times before responding. He needed to cancel the weekend they had planned in Campos do Jordão. Company matters, it said, but the tone of the message had that specific texture of someone who is managing a situation that is spiraling out of control. Isabella responded with 2 words, put her phone away and opened the file for a new client's fee contract. She had a lot of work. And suddenly, for the first time in months, that seemed like the healthiest thing on her own horizon. The deal that changed everything was closed on a Tuesday in September, in an office on the 30th floor of a building on Barini, with air conditioning that was too strong and a meeting table large enough to intimidate whoever needed to be intimidated. Raphael didn't need to be. On the other side of the table were the representatives of Horizonte Logistica, one of the largest distribution operators in the country, with a presence in 18 states and a technology structure that had fallen behind while the company grew faster than its capacity to modernize. They had reached Fluxara through a referral. The operations director of the pharmacy chain had recommended the product at a sector event, and the recommendation had reached Horizonte's CTO with the credibility that only real experience produces. The negotiations had lasted 6 weeks. Claudio was present in every round, as were the lawyers from both sides, and there were moments when Raphael felt the weight of those weeks as a physical tension in his shoulders. But he never wavered on substance. He knew what the product was worth and did not accept terms that compromised that valuation. The contract that was signed that Tuesday was a 3-year licensing agreement with an expansion clause, an annual value that placed Fluxara on a completely different level than it had been 6 months before, and an initial installment that, added to the capital from the seed round, transformed the financial reality of the company in a way that Raphael was still processing. Claudio shook his hand at the elevator exit and said it was time to think about the next round. Raphael agreed, but asked for 48 hours before starting to talk about it. Claudio understood, without needing it to be explained. Raphael walked to the Villa Olympia metro station. He went down to the Green Line, took the train toward Consolação, and stood in the car with his hand on the plastic strap, looking at his own reflection in the dark window. Around him, people carried on with their lives with the indifference that the São Paulo metro demands. No one knew what had happened on that 30th floor. No one needed to know. He got off at Clinicus, walked through the neighborhood with no specific destination, ended up arriving at Parque do Trianon, and sat on a bench under a tipuana tree that was starting to release its winged seeds of late summer. He stayed there for maybe an hour, without a phone in his hand, just sitting with the weight and the lightness of that day. He thought about things he hadn't let in for quite a while. He thought about the years of solitary construction, about the nights when doubt hit not about the product, but about himself, about whether he was doing the right thing by betting everything on an idea that only he could see clearly. He thought about the divorce, not with anger or bitterness, but with that lucidity that time sometimes offers. There was something that didn't work in that marriage long before the suitcase appeared in the middle of the room. Perhaps both knew it, and neither had the courage to name it before it was inevitable. He thought about Isabella with a mixture of feelings that resisted simple categories. There were genuine things in that marriage. There were real moments between two real people. That didn't disappear just because the end had been hard. But there was also the pattern she had chosen, the way she evaluated the world, the inability to see value where it wasn't wrapped in appearance, that he couldn't change, and it wasn't his responsibility to try. He got up from the bench when the sun began to tilt seriously toward the horizon of buildings on Consolação. He walked back to the station, took the metro to Pinheiros, and went straight to the studio. He called his sister before opening the computer. Carol answered on the second ring as if she were waiting. He told her. Carol was silent for a moment that this time Raphael knew how to recognize. It wasn't disconcertment. It was the absorption of someone who is feeling something that will take time to process completely. Then she asked, her voice a little choked up, "Are you happy, Rafa?" He thought about the question seriously, because it deserved it. "I am, Carol. I really am." She said she was going to get her hair trimmed on Saturday, and that he had to have dinner at her house afterward, that she was going to make the chicken with okra that he liked since he was 10, and that she was going to call their mother too, because that was a reason for a family celebration. He said yes, that he would show up early, that he would bring the wine. Then he hung up, opened the computer, and stood looking at the screen for a moment before starting to work. The fig tree on the sidewalk was still in the still air of that September night. Raphael opened a new file, began sketching the plan for the next phase of the product, and felt, with a clarity that required no words, that he was exactly where he had worked to be. What he didn't know on that silent night in Pinheiros was that on the other side of the city, the news of the deal with Horizonte was already circulating. The São Paulo tech market was large and noisy, but the corridors where relevant information traveled were surprisingly narrow. And at least one point in those corridors, the name Fluxara had reached ears that didn't yet know what to do with it, but already felt the weight of what it meant. Time, which Raphael had learned to respect as an ally, was about to accelerate its work toward encounters that didn't yet have a set date, but were already inevitable. That same week, a report was published in the most read business portal of the São Paulo B2B segment. The title was direct: Fluxara closes deal with Horizonte Logistica and enters the radar of major funds. The text was objective, with data from the agreement that the journalist had partially obtained through industry sources, and included a quote from Claudio Menezes about the product's potential. Raphael had declined to speak to the press at that moment, a decision that Claudio respected without question. The report was shared in industry groups, reposted on LinkedIn by logistics and technology executives, and reached, as all important things reach São Paulo, the right people, even before most others knew it was important. It reached Patricia Fontes's phone at 8 in the morning. Patricia, who had planted the initial news about Fluxara for Isabella at a lunch at Easy Bistro, forwarded the report to her with a 3-word message. "I told you, right?" Isabella opened the link sitting in the kitchen, with her coffee still in her hand, and read the text twice. Then she sat looking at the cup, as if it contained some answer the text hadn't given. The name of the company Raphael had built in silence, in the early hours she had called a waste, was now in a report that anyone in the São Paulo corporate world could read. She put the cup in the sink, went to take a shower, and arrived at the office 40 minutes later with her usual punctuality. But throughout that day, between one project and another, the name Fluxara returned like the kind of thing the mind can't let go of because it hasn't finished understanding what to do with it. Henrique Castillo entered Isabella's life as someone who had learned to appear to be one thing and was another. And he left the same way, without drama, without scenes larger than necessary, with that kind of evaporation that men who live by appearance master better than any other skill. The relationship didn't end in a decisive conversation. It ended in layers throughout October, in a series of progressive withdrawals that each pretended not to notice. A cancelled dinner that wasn't rescheduled, a conversation about the future that he deflected, with the skill of someone who does so frequently. An afternoon when she waited for a message that didn't come and decided not to send her own. Until one Sunday night, with the city wet from a rain that had lasted all day, Isabella received a message from him saying that he needed to concentrate on resolving some company matters, that it wasn't the right time for him to be in a relationship, that she deserved someone with more availability. It was the kind of text people write when they want to end something without taking responsibility for the ending. She read it once, put the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She didn't cry, which surprised her. There was a sadness, but it wasn't the sharp sadness of losing something one loved. It was the drier and deeper sadness of someone who realizes that what they lost wasn't quite what they thought they had. The next day, she learned through Marina that Castillo Incorporações had entered into a negotiation process with creditors. The luxury Henrique displayed was sustained by credit lines that were being called in. The apartment he said he had bought in Jardim Europa was actually financed at a rate that the due diligence consultant had identified as unsustainable in the medium term. The castle had begun to collapse. Isabella heard this information with the composure learned over years of difficult meetings. She thanked Marina, hung up the phone, and sat in the office for a moment with her hands on the desk, fingers interlaced, looking at the project on the screen without seeing it. There was a lesson there that she could no longer afford to ignore. She had evaluated Raphael by the wrong criteria. She had confused the absence of display with the absence of substance. She had interpreted silence as stagnation when it was actually concentration. She had left a man who was building to get close to one who pretended to have built. And the separation agreement she had demanded with such care, thinking she was protecting herself from a lusterless future, had guaranteed that she would never have any right to the future he was building. The irony was surgical. and completely deserved. In the following days, she worked with that intensity that appears when personal life collapses and work becomes the only firm ground. She finalized 3 projects that were behind schedule, captured a new client through a referral, and spent an afternoon reorganizing the office in an impulse for order that she knew, rationally, was a way of dealing with internal disorder. And then came the lawyer. Not hers. A colleague in the market who knew her from events and who, upon discreetly learning of the situation, called to tell her what he knew about the separation agreement she had signed. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and confirmed what she had already sensed: the total separation of assets, drafted with the intention of protecting her from Raphael, worked perfectly in both directions. No assets acquired after the signing belonged to the other. No future assets were subject to any claim. Fluxara, with all its contracts and all its growth, was entirely Raphael's. She had closed her own door with her own hands. The lawyer, prudent, said there was only one theoretical possibility for a challenge: if it were possible to demonstrate that the company had been established with the couple's assets during the marriage. But for that it would be necessary to prove that the initial capital was shared, which, given that Raphael had developed the software without any external or family investment, would be very difficult to sustain. Isabella thanked him, hung up, and stood looking out the office window at the street below. The first message she sent to Raphael was on a Thursday night. Simple, without elaboration, almost casual. "Hi, Raphael. I was thinking of you these days. Hope you're doing well." He didn't respond that day. He responded 2 days later, with the brevity of someone who is busy and doesn't want to be rude. "Hi, Isabella. Everything's fine here. You?" It was a door slightly ajar. She pushed. In the following weeks, the messages became more frequent. She evoked memories with care, mentioned things she had liked in the marriage, asked questions about his work with an interest that sounded genuine because it was genuine, at least in part. There was in her a mixture of real feelings and calculation that she couldn't completely separate, which in itself was a problem she preferred not to examine. Raphael responded when he responded, always with cordiality and always with a distance that wasn't hostile but was definitive. It was like talking to someone who keeps the door open out of politeness but didn't insist that you come in. She didn't give up. She sent a more direct message on a Tuesday. "Can I call you one of these days? I wanted to talk for real." Raphael took 2 days to respond. When he responded, he said he was in an intense period of work, but that he could meet her one afternoon the following week, if she wanted. She wanted. While waiting for that meeting she had scheduled for a Wednesday in the late afternoon, Isabella spent the nights processing what she would say, how she would say it, what she hoped would happen. There was a growing honesty in this process that she needed to recognize. It wasn't just Fluxara. There was something older and truer than financial regret, something she had been pushing under other layers for months, and that now resisted staying hidden. She had liked Raphael in a way she hadn't been able to reproduce with anyone else, and she had destroyed that with her own values that now, honestly examined, made her ashamed. Wednesday arrived with that light October rain that São Paulo sometimes produces, the kind that doesn't get you wet but colors everything in grey-blue. Isabella got ready without exaggeration, went to the meeting by bus and metro because the traffic was impossible, and arrived at the Villa Maddalena Café he had suggested exactly at the agreed time. Raphael was already there, sitting in a corner with a coffee in front of him, reading something on his phone with that concentration that was specifically his. He raised his eyes when she entered, nodded his head, and waited for her to sit down. She sat down, ordered a tea. And then she realized, with a clarity that hurt exactly as important truths usually hurt, that the conversation she was about to have was different from the conversation she had rehearsed. Because on the other side of the table was not a man who needed her, who had waited for her, who was vulnerable enough to receive what she had to say. On the other side of the table was someone who had become fine, and who, in some way she was still learning to understand, had become fine because of everything that had happened, not despite it. The Villa Maddalena Café had that smell of old wood and roasted beans that São Paulo keeps in few places. It was small, with worn marble tables and chairs that were different from one another, the kind of space that resists gentrification not by principle, but by stubbornness. Raphael had chosen it because it was near the co-working space, and because, honestly, he hadn't thought much beyond that. Isabella was different. He noticed that as soon as she entered. Not different in a way he could describe with precision, not a detail of clothing or hair. It was something in the way she moved, a slightly cracked lightness that wasn't there when they were married, as if some layers of varnish had come off and what was underneath was more real, even if more vulnerable. She ordered a chamomile tea, which surprised him. Isabella was a black coffee person. They talked for a moment about nothing. That social protocol of reheating that people do when there is a history between them and the present doesn't yet know where to position itself in relation to it. She asked about the work. He answered with the restraint of someone who doesn't want to seem like he's bragging, and she listened with an attention that seemed too genuine to be entirely strategic. Then she said, looking at the tea, "I made many mistakes, Raphael." He didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of coffee and waited. She continued. She said she had confused things that shouldn't have been confused, that she had evaluated the marriage with the wrong criteria, and that she had only understood this when she was forced to examine her own values closely, without the comfort of having someone to blame. She said she wasn't there to ask for anything in practical terms, that she knew the agreement was what it was, and that she herself had demanded those terms. She said she was there because there was an honesty she owed to him, and perhaps even more to herself. Raphael heard everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't gesture, didn't let his face reveal more than listening. When she finished, there was a silence of maybe 10 seconds that in the noisy environment of the cafe seemed like a bubble separated from the world. He said, "I hear what you're saying, and I think it's honest of you to say it." She waited, but he continued, with that calm she had called stagnation and now recognized as something else entirely. "I need to be honest too. What you called a mistake, I called who you were, and perhaps still are, in part, I don't know. But I can't pretend the problem was only one of evaluation. There was a way of seeing me, of seeing the marriage, of seeing what had value, that was fundamental to you, and I didn't change that, and you didn't change it on your own either." She looked at the tea, said nothing. "I don't hold anger," he said. "It's not that. But you're not here for me, Isabella. You're here because the things you bet on went wrong, and now what was here looks different. And that difference isn't about me having changed. It's about the perspective having changed, and those two things are not the same." She raised her eyes. There was something in them he hadn't seen in the 3 years of marriage. She was present in a way pride hadn't allowed before. "You're right," she said, "about everything. And I knew that before coming here, but I needed to hear it from you." He nodded his head slightly, like someone recognizing that this makes sense without necessarily knowing what to do with it. They stayed a little longer, drank what was left in the cups, and exchanged a few more words about neutral things, about a restaurant that had opened near her office, about the winter that hadn't come with the expected strength. It was the conversation of two people saying goodbye to something, without wanting to name what it is, because naming it makes it real in a way that still hurts more than necessary. When they got up to leave, she hugged him quickly, that hug of someone who isn't sure they have the right but takes the risk. He reciprocated without rigidity and without excessive warmth, with the exactness of things that have ended but don't need to pretend they didn't exist. She left first. Raphael stayed to pay at the counter, heard the door close, and then stood a moment still looking at the marble of the counter. The barista, a guy in his early 20s with a messy bun, asked if everything was okay. Raphael said it was, left a generous tip, and left. Outside, the light October rain had stopped. The street was wet and shiny under the lights of the shops, with that specific smell of São Paulo after the rain, which isn't of wet earth like in the interior, but of asphalt and history and movement. He walked toward the co-working space with his hands in his pockets, without haste. There was a presentation to prepare for the following week. Claudio had confirmed the interest of 2 larger funds for a Series A that could take Fluxara to a completely different level. Tiago and Priya were working on a new module Raphael had sketched on an August afternoon, and that was taking shape in a way that genuinely excited him. There was a lot to do. And there was that feeling, which had been growing discreetly for months and that afternoon had finally solidified. The feeling that he was in the right place, doing the right thing, the right way. Not to prove anything to anyone, not to contradict a narrative someone had built about him, but because it was true, because it was his, because it had been built with his own hands in a small room with a view of a crooked fig tree that insisted on growing where it hadn't been planned. Raphael turned the corner, entered the co-working space, waved to the receptionist, and went up to the room where Tiago and Priya were still working that October afternoon. He pulled up a chair, opened the computer, and asked how the module was. Tiago said he had found a synchronization problem but already knew how to solve it. Raphael said, "Then go for it," and went back to work. That night, back in the Pinheiros studio, Raphael stood for a time at the window before sleeping. The fig tree on the sidewalk was still in the still air. He had thought several times about moving to a larger place now that he had the means for it. But there was something about that studio he wasn't ready to leave. It wasn't an attachment to discomfort. It was respect for the history of the place, for what had happened there, for the man he had become on that third floor, with a view of a tree that grew wrong and became beautiful because of it. Maybe one of these days he would move. But not yet. He closed the window, turned off the light, and slept without dreams, which is the most honest way to sleep. On the other side of the city, Isabella arrived at the apartment, prepared a hot tea, sat in the armchair in the living room, and sat looking at the shelf she had decorated with such care, at the objects chosen one by one with the precision of someone who knows what they want to communicate. It was a beautiful apartment. It was, in many ways, exactly what she had worked to have. And she was sitting in it alone, with a tea that was getting cold, processing a conversation that had lasted less than an hour, but would probably last inside her for much longer than that. There was no catastrophe. There was no drama. There was only the quiet weight of a truth she had avoided for too long, and that was now sitting with her in the armchair, drinking tea, and waiting for her to decide what she was going to do with this company. She stayed awake until late that night. Not thinking about Raphael, not thinking about Henrique, not thinking about agreements or lawyers or investment rounds, thinking about herself, about the person she had become and the person she wanted to be, which was perhaps the same conversation she had been avoiding her whole life. It was a late start, but it was a start. 6 months later, Fluxara closed its Series A. The investment came from a São Paulo fund in partnership with a Lisboa fund, in a structure Claudio had stitched together over 3 months of negotiations that required trips, video conferences in inconvenient time zones, and a patience Raphael had learned to cultivate as a practical skill. The amount was not publicly disclosed, but it was enough for Fluxara to go from a team of 3 to a team of 16, move to its own office in Vila Olympia, and begin the expansion process to 2 other countries in Latin America. The report that appeared on the largest business portal in Brazil had a photo of Raphael in front of the new office, sunlit sidewalk of Vila Olympia in the background, with that smile people make when they are genuinely content and are not trying to appear to be anything. The title said, "From a studio in Pinheiros to the Latin American market, the story of the software no one bet on." Carol shared the report with the caption, "My favorite brother." His mother called and cried a little, which was her way of saying she was proud. Tiago and Priya saw the photo in the meeting room of the new office and made the kind of inside joke that only small teams that grew together can make. Raphael read the report once, saved the link on his computer, and went back to work. There was a new client in Bogotá who needed attention. Isabella learned about the Series A through LinkedIn, like most people. It was a Monday morning and she was in the Itaim office with Fernanda's coffee still hot when the notification appeared. She read the full report with the attention she had learned to give to things that were important, even when it was difficult. She had spent the last few months in a process she described to herself as reorganization, a word honest enough for what was happening, weekly therapy with a psychologist who made her uncomfortable and helped her in the same proportion, a break from social media that had lasted longer than she planned, and that had revealed how much of her life was built for an audience, a period of intense work that had rediscovered in her a capacity for focus that the relationship with Henrique had obscured. She hadn't sent any more messages to Raphael after the conversation at the Villa Maddalena Café. She had understood that afternoon that some doors we close with our own hands stay closed for reasons that make sense, even when they hurt, and that the right thing to do was not to try to reopen them, but to learn what the key taught about herself. She closed LinkedIn, finished her coffee, and opened the project of a new client, a cultural foundation that wanted to completely renew the identity of the space. It was an interesting job, the kind that required more than technical competence, that required vision. She liked that. She had always liked it, and had lost contact with that taste during a period when she was looking at the wrong place. It was a common Monday morning in São Paulo. The city made its usual noise outside, that noise that never stops, and that after a while you don't hear anymore, because it becomes the permanent background to everything. Raphael arrived at the Villa Olympia office at 8:20, greeted the receptionist they had hired 2 weeks before, passed through the engineering area where Tiago was standing before a whiteboard explaining something to 2 of the new hires, and went to his office at the end of the hall. The room had a large window with a view of the street, and outside there was an almond tree growing on the sidewalk with the specific tenacity of trees that chose to exist in the middle of concrete. It wasn't a crooked fig tree, but it would do. Raphael put his coffee on the table, opened the computer, and checked the morning emails. There was a message from Bogotá, one from Lisboa, and one from the operations director of Horizonte about a contract expansion. There was also an internal message from Priya with the subject, Forecast Module Update, with a rocket emoji that he smiled upon seeing. He started with the one from Bogotá. The day was beginning as all days began, with work that needed to be done, with problems that needed solutions, with the clear conscience of someone who knows where they are and how they got there. There was no narrative of revenge in that. There was no triumph over anyone. There was only a life being lived with wholeness, and the silence of one who doesn't need the world to confirm what he himself already knows. Outside, São Paulo made its eternal noise, and inside that Villa Olympia office, a company continued growing like the trees no one planned. Slowly at first, with roots deeper than the surface revealed, and then in a way that made people wonder why they hadn't seen it before. End of story. If this story touched something in you, it's because some truths have the power to do that. They arrive quietly, without warning, and stay longer than we expected. Raphael didn't scream, didn't take revenge, didn't ask for applause. He simply built in silence what he believed had value. And sometimes that is exactly what we need to remember when the world insists we are on the wrong path. If you reach this point, you are the type of person who stays until the end of the stories that matter. So stay here with us too. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and leave in the comments what you took from this story. Every comment counts. Every like helps us continue bringing narratives that make you think, that make you feel, that stay. There is much more coming, and we want to meet you in the next story. That almond tree in Villa Olympia grew without anyone having planned for it, without anyone having arrived early in the morning with a shovel and a landscaping project and a long-term vision. It was simply there, with roots that went deeper than any sidewalk seemed to allow, and branches that each season showed that time was on its side. Raphael observed it sometimes through the office window, in those moments between one task and another when the mind needs a second of absence before returning with more clarity. And he thought, without needing to turn it into philosophy, that the things that grow where they weren't planned are sometimes the most resilient of all. Not because resilience is a virtue in itself, but because when something finds its own way without a map, it learns the terrain in a way no map could have taught. It was a Monday in April when the second report came out. This time it wasn't a sector portal. It was one of the largest business portals in the country, with a headline on the cover that Claudio sent by message at 7:15 in the morning with the comment, "Look at what you did." The report was extensive, with an interview Raphael had given the week before after years of avoiding the press. The journalist had asked about the trajectory, about the years of solitary development, about what had been most difficult. Raphael answered with honesty and without drama. The hardest part was continuing to believe in the product when no one around could see what I saw. It wasn't stubbornness. It was that I knew the problem better than anyone and knew the solution was real. The report did not mention the divorce. Raphael had not mentioned it, and the journalist had not asked. That was a story about work, not about the marriage that ended. The two things had happened in parallel, influenced each other mutually, but one was not the reason for the other. Fluxara would exist either way. Isabella would have left either way. São Paulo would continue spinning either way. Tiago printed the report and taped it to the engineering area board with colored tape and wrote in pen below. Chapter 1. Raphael saw it as he passed in the hall and stood looking for a moment before continuing to walk. Chapter 1. Yes, it was exactly that. There was much more ahead. There was Bogotá and there was Buenos Aires, and there were initial conversations with potential partners in Portugal that Claudio had been cultivating with the gardener's patience he had for international business. There was a product that continued to evolve because the problems it solved continued to exist and become more complex as the operations that adopted it grew. There was a team that had chosen to be there, that could be somewhere else, and had decided to bet on what Raphael was building. It was more than he had imagined when he first sat before two monitors on a raw wood table bought for 300 reais, with a view of a crooked fig tree on Teodoro Sampaio Street. And at the same time it was exactly what he had expected, not as a dream, but as a logical consequence of doing the work every day with enough honesty. The rest was time doing what time does when you let it work without getting in the way.